Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Unresolved Textual Tension. My name is Lindberg and I am today's guest as we do the second book in the Wolf Hall trilogy. I am joined by my lovely co-hosts Maria and William.
Hey guys, what's up? She forgot to
Woo!
say it, but I'm rugged and handsome. And don't look like a murderer like Cromwell, though. That may be somewhat
We don't.
over.
I love how that got mentioned, like one of the pieces that got mentioned again in this book.
It's one of the first
Let's not
parts.
pretend William would love if he looked like a murderer.
Okay, so this is the second book, like Lindbergh said, in the Wolf Hall trilogy, following Cromwell's life. For those who don't know, Cromwell was like the guy who was like the second hand of Henry the something when he was divorcing and or killing all of his wives. In the first
Henry VIII.
I can never remember, and I always think he has 7 wives, and he didn't. He had 6, I think. So I don't
There's a
know.
whole musical.
He had 5 and the wife that never was.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So there's that. But this is the second book chronicling his life. We previously did Wolf Hall, which we all adored. Our book club did not adore it, and we understood the criticisms of it. But this time it's just going to be us because I didn't feel like putting them through that again. Yeah, we have
Let's
different
face it,
thoughts.
they wouldn't go through it. Not even for you, Will.
This is a shorter book too, and it's a lot more focused in a lot of ways, which I feel is both a strength and a weakness.
I actually think a lot of them would have preferred the second book over the first book because I think a lot of their problems with it are just already are fixed, including, and I'll talk about this, some of my complaints that I had when I first started reading Wolf Hall. It's like Mantel. It's like a bunch of people complained to Mantel about a particular issue, and she goes, "Fine." He, Cromwell,
she does that 3 separate times. It's so funny.
It's so funny. But yeah, so
you can just hear the exasperation.
Yeah, like goddamn these dumb readers. But yeah, so I actually think a lot of them, and if any of you are watching, hey guys, we miss you. But some of you I think might enjoy the second book more than the first book because it fixes a lot of your problems, which we'll talk about. But we need to be premise.
Okay. Lindbergh, can you give a premise but not mention John Gwynne this time?
But you cut my arm off, and then you're like, how can you do it?
Play
can you
tennis.
still lift this thing?
Yeah.
Like, I'm crippled now. The premise for this second book is that Wolf Hall trilogy follows the life and death of Thomas Cromwell. In the first book, we see the fall of Cardinal Wolsey and Cromwell's comeuppance in the English court beneath Henry VIII. And yes, that English court and that Henry VIII, the infamous one with all the wives. And we see the schism with the church, we see the dissolution of the marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and we see the marriage between him and Anne Boleyn. In this second book, we see what happens after the rosy shimmer wears off, and how slowly Henry does a bit of a regression and starts thinking about all the other beautiful women he could have in his bed.
This entire book's a really good argument for you should probably sleep with someone before you get married.
No.
Yes.
No, because then you might find out that they know weird French bed tips, and how would they know those if they've never slept with anyone?
But at least you know that before you got married.
What does it mean when a woman turns this way and that? What
Exactly.
does it mean when she does that?
When she does weird things with her mouth.
Oh,
yeah. Gosh, where has she been, the slanderous whore?
So, kind of connected to that, this is basically the story of Anne Boleyn's fall. From the end of Catherine of Aragon's death to Anne Boleyn's beheading. Spoiler alert. Go ahead, Maria. Because I cut you off, sorry.
No, it's okay. But yeah, and the book is, because it is telling a specific story, basically picking up very close to the end of the last book, going straight through to Anne Boleyn's death, which happens in like a year. It's not. They're married like 3 years. But it's a very tighter story. There's much less big time skips in it. It's one of the things that we spoke about that we liked, but we understood why other people wouldn't like in the last book was that there was a lot of asides that didn't have to do with the main through plot of what that book was. And it didn't really have one. It had like some arcs of things that Cromwell was dealing with versus this book, which has a very clear, this is the downfall of Anne Boleyn. Like, that's what you're watching. This is the show. And so there's much less like, oh, now we're dealing with this weird religious thing, and now we're dealing with this, and now we're having a conversation over here. And Will and I were talking about how there's much less of like the cozy, how are things at Austin Friars moment, and stuff like that. So I think for a lot of people who found the first book very disjointed and that they were great scenes, but kind of in a soup, that like they were just floating in, I think this functions much more narratively straightforward. So I think a lot of people would like it in that way. I did miss there was, as much as I think of, yes, I missed the soup. Objectively, I think this is a stronger book because it is tighter. The scope is very clear. It is telling a specific story. Subjectively, I kind of miss the like lackadaisical in and out of different stories and popping into different moments. And also, I liked Cromwell is just a generally good guy daddy, and now he's a bit of
he's a bit of a bad daddy.
Cromwell's in his bad daddy era. Yeah, Cromwell, why are you doing this? Why are you doing it? No, Cromwell, no.
Yeah, he's hitting his shadow daddy area, but it's not sexy. It's not just mean. Why do you do this?
And you're like,
mommy boy.
And it's not going to go well for you. Like, you're just sitting here, and like, we know. Because of history, we know what's going to happen to Tommy Cromwell.
And in this book, you can see how he starts making the mistakes that are going to get him, because his philosophy is basically that Wolsey tried to do everything by the book. He tried to appease Henry, but he tried to do it by the book, and it wasn't fast enough, so that was Wolsey's downfall. So I'm just going to give Henry anything he wants. If he wants my body, I'll give that to him too. And you can just tell how this is not going to end well, poor Cromwell.
You're being too competent, my guy. You're going the opposite direction, and it also, because I made the note to Will. It's like this sword of Damocles has been like, it's in frame now. Like we knew in the first book, because we knew the history, Cromwell's gonna die, but like now suddenly the sword's here, and you can see it as the reader, and you're like, no, Cromwell, I adore you. Yeah. Please stop.
It's about halfway through this book, it just became real to me that this character that I have invested so much emotion in has been dead for several hundred years already, and there is no saving him.
There's no.
And I'm like, no.
And it's crazy. Emotionally, I found it so depressing. Like, at multiple points, I was just really depressed because you're watching. Because you do. Mantel makes you love this man. Like, if you enjoyed the soup of this first book, you walked away loving Crommy. You're like, I'm here for you. You're a good guy. You're doing the best you can with the tools you're given. And now you're like, you're making tools, Cromwell, and the king's going to be scared by the tools you're making. Stop doing it. I know you're doing it for it, but it's good. And you're just watching him, and you can't stop it.
And you're becoming, you make the mistake of becoming a player, Cromwell. Yep. You were good when you were just Henry's second, his right hand, but now you're becoming a player, and that's dangerous. Stop.
I found this book to be both better and worse than the first one in certain ways. So basically, up till about 2/3 of the way through the book, I was like, I actually would suggest this as the first book for people to read in certain ways. It's a lot more focused, like Maria said. All of the plots kind of converge back as a central point to the Boleyn affair. Whereas in the first book, you weren't always there wasn't like that spine for everything to relate back to. They were sort of individual threads. And this is also a shorter book, and also you're like, oh, we know where this is going with Anne Boleyn, so there's a feeling of impending tragedy about it. And then I found and the other reason I think it's more focused is that this is really the last third of the first book in terms of like all the setup is out of the way. This really kind of belongs to the first book in terms of being the proper climax and falling action. So like you just get all the adrenaline parts and not the building up parts. The problem I found was that at the end, I found it somewhat anticlimactic because, again, these books, as we've talked about, aren't really historical fiction. They're just telling the story of these people as they go about history. So, for example, I talked about this last time, but this time there's not necessarily a very satisfying moment of Anne Boleyn and Cromwell like coming to grips and having the final discussion that's like cathartic for you as the reader. They kind of like happens in the distance a little bit because that's how it was. She feels like she can't mess with history too much, and so she's writing within the constraints of I can't really change events around to be more interesting. So like at the end of the book, Mantel has a thing where she talks about the few things she did change, which goes to show that like she was actually pretty aware of everybody who was a historian who was reading this. So like you can tell that like, oh no, she kind of felt like it was important. And so there are the highs where you're like, okay, I'm here, but you do miss some of the low moments of like the Austin Friars and the chill moments, and then the ending.
I really
of this
miss the
is
court gossip.
Yeah, the court gossip, and like this time it's like you get to the end and you're a bit like, okay, that was depressing, and also wasn't necessarily hugely cathartic. And now we know he's gonna die. So like we knew before, but like this time it's very clearly like
it becomes very real that this is history and this isn't fiction, and history doesn't always offer you the happy ending that you want. So this is a slow decline towards a dark destination. And the big baddie, who is Henry, is just he is the king. He doesn't. Nobody gets their comeuppance against him. He's not gonna be dethroned, or the France is not gonna come to take his crown. He's gonna get his way, and it's gonna be terrible. So in a sense, this book almost becomes a little bit too real. It's a bit too much realism at one point. I do miss the levity of the last book as well.
Yeah, and Cromwell was also, the first book was funnier. I just realized that this book just isn't as funny as the first one. It is still funny and it is still well written. Like, let me just say that here. Mantel is an excellent writer. She's still witty. Her dialogue is still great. The interactions are fantastic. But there were genuine moments that made me laugh in the first one that you don't see. And part of that is the people Cromwell was the best with and the funniest with were his family. Like, a lot of his funniest moments were with Rafe Sadler. And Rafe is just not, because historically, Rafe got put with the king and ended up in his court and was close by him all the time. And so, which means he's not with Cromwell. And there's much less of him interacting with his family. Obviously, because, some of them are dead now. And I felt a really good encapsulation of the tone shift from the first book to the second one was the peacock feather wings, and how they're in the first book, they're kind of this bright, lovely thing that his daughter Grace gets to wear. And it's how he remembers her in this shining kind of glimmering, and then asking if she can go pray with her wings. And then in this book, their shining moment is where they scare a man into confessing things that aren't necessarily true because they touched him. And when Cromwell goes to look at them afterwards, they're faded and decaying, and he knows he needs to throw them away. And it's kind of this loss of the joy of life. That's what I felt from Cromwell in this book, is that Cromwell does not have much joy anymore. And like, Cromwell in book one had happy moments and had like, it felt like, a guy who's good at his job, making the best of his situations, but like who can laugh about it later. And you don't That's not the
Yeah, he
Cromwell we
felt
get.
cheeky and shrewd and sort of antagonistic towards the people he was serving at the same time. Whereas
Yep.
in this book, you just at the end he feels so cynical, and you can
And
just feel the spark that was his family has sort of gone out.
and he's also a bit overconfident. Like there's this part right at the end where he was like, anyone who comes at him, he will entrench himself, he'll be ready. And I'm like, against anyone except Henry, Crummy, my boy. Against anyone except Henry. And you're just like,
you're still
oh.
a blacksmith's son, dude.
Yeah.
You're not these people's better. You're just in a better position right now.
Well, and what you've done is centralize power to Henry. So because you get your power through Henry, that's good for you. But it also means that if Henry turns on you, there aren't institutionally any things that can really protect you, which I always thought was kind of the tragedy of Wolsey and Cromwell. And it's interesting because this book plays with kind of your expectations of the story. Because if you know the history, there are certain there's a certain narrative that goes through it of like who the good guy is and who the bad guy is and kind of like what's going on in it. I used the example last time of Anne Boleyn not sleeping with Henry before they were married being something that everyone kind of universally believes as part of the narrative, but actually we have absolutely no evidence, contemporarily speaking, that was the case. And like there are certain things here where you're like, okay, so the book, for example, with Anne Boleyn will be like, yeah, she kind of turned on her family, and that's one of the reasons they were kind of entirely okay with betraying her. And it kind of does make you think like, okay, maybe she was like cheating on the king. That would be real bad. Like there is usually that's played entirely as like, oh, Henry was being a crazy person. But like actually there is some evidence that like that might have been occurring or not occurring depending on the evidence at hand. I see Lindbergh trying to already beginning to want to defend her, but I'm just saying it's somewhat of an ambiguous situation, more so than it's usually portrayed in history.
Lindbergh?
I just wanted to say that, that the king was gross and stinky and mean.
I don't disagree.
Who can kind of blame her if she got hers on the side? I mean, I'm sure it happened all the time, and we don't know what truly happened. We will never
first
know.
of all, this is a positive
I like that the book
podcast.
Doesn't actually feel like it needs to sit down and say, oh, this is what really happened. Behind the scenes.
I was telling Maria.
It more shows it like a play before us that, oh, this is what this person said, and this is what this person said, and this person had this motivation for saying this. And you can tell how people just come together to sort of save their own skin or advance themselves. And no one really knows the truth, and no one really cares about the truth.
I was telling Maria, the thing with Cromwell is at one point I was trying to figure out, like, okay, does he actually believe this happened or didn't happen? And then I realized it's actually really telling of Cromwell's character that he probably doesn't need to have an answer to that. He's such a practical, material person that it really only matters what other people think and what he can do with this information. Like, it's interesting because sometimes in history, there's often the idea that, like, historians know a thing, or one thing is right or one thing is wrong. And I read a history blog, which you guys hear me talk about all the time. Shout out Brett Devereux. And one of the things he talked about is that, like, as a historian, sometimes you're like, yeah, there's like a 60% chance that happened and a 40% chance it didn't. And you like, that's the answer. The answer is we don't know, but this seems more likely than that. And in this case, it's kind of like, yeah, Cromwell's just like, yeah, I don't know. I'm okay with not knowing though. Because all I really care about is the
purposes to further these rumors. Because at the time, Anne Boleyn was becoming inconvenient to him.
And it's crazy because I feel for Anne Boleyn in the way that I think Lindbergh's right. I think in most court romances, the kings and queens are getting their side pieces. Like, I just think historically, that's probably like one of the things you learn here is that like people were doing stuff. There's this idea we have of the past as, and I mentioned this in the first book, as a very chaste, oh, people didn't do it like that back then. Nah, humans been nasty forever. We've been doing weird shit forever.
There was a reason too why there were so many poxers going around.
Yes.
People be horny.
people be horny. And so I fully believe that, because like there's one point where one of the ladies in waiting is like, but everybody does this. But Boleyn is going to get strung up, not because of the actual thing she did or didn't do, but because she was with a guy who no longer wanted to be married to her, but could not get rid of her outside of using this method. And it's, I look at it, and as much as, because like, listen, Anne Boleyn might have been a raging fucking bitch, you know, but they were like obsessed with each other for 7. And again, this is why you need to sleep with people before you get married, because I think fundamentally one of the problems is sexually they just weren't compatible. There was too much buildup. It was like it became this like magical monumental thing, and then I think they finally did the deed. And again, conjecture, no proof for any of this,
and
but
also,
especially
though,
within the context of this book.
She couldn't have a son,
Yeah, Henry
which is
just
kind of
loved
the big
the
thing.
chase.
Yep. And you, especially if you bill yourself as the girl who's going to give him a son, like that's a problem, because it just like you cannot control that, and it's such a fragile
and the book
position.
Kind of a few times the book sort of hints at Henry's sometimes willingness to perform, but lack thereof. And with Anne miscarrying,
that is
stuff,
slander.
It would make absolute sense in a way for her to have lovers on the side if she felt like, you know, Henry wasn't putting it in often enough. The chance to give him what he wanted wasn't even presented to her, and yet she was entirely bearing the responsibility of the outcome.
There's
this is why. Go, Will. Finish your point.
There's a movie called The Other Boleyn Girl that's not very good, but there is one really harrowing scene where Anne Boleyn and Mary Boleyn and their brother, I forget his name, are like, we're trapped here. We can't get out. He's going to kill me if I can't get a son, and I can't cheat without somebody noticing. So they kind of are like, her and her brother look at each other and are like, okay, this is how we could get, I could get inseminated in a way that nobody would ever be able to find out. And there's a scene where they start trying and they just can't, like they're like shaking and they're like, we can't do it. That I always thought was like a very harrowing scene, because it's like the cold calculations of this situation. In this book, we find out that Brother 11 might be a little bit easier than that scene portrayed it as. But yeah, there is a sense.
Fun fact. The Other Boleyn Girl is actually based off a book by Philippa Gregory. Philippa Gregory is an author I've been trying to sell to you because she writes absolutely debauched, terrible, dramatic stories that are historical fiction.
I think what you were trying to sell to me was War and Peace. So let's be real. But that was a moment where I liked that the book and that scene, and then the book also just kind of shows that, like, yeah, she is responsible for this thing that she has no ability to provide. Though it is a little iffy. One of the things I did like about the book is, like, everybody in the book is like, oh, Henry can't have sex with her while she's pregnant because that might hurt the baby. Everyone thinks this completely unscientific thing. And so there is an extent to which you're like...
People thought this for a long time.
But, like, it's so funny because it shows that, like, yeah, they don't really understand some of it. They're not necessarily always being hypocritical. They just also don't really understand the material sciences very well. So maybe they really do think something like, oh, something's going on if she's not having a son, or it's not, maybe God is being a little bit weird about these things. And I just like that as a little point for just in terms of getting you in the mindset of the world and how ambiguous this is to the people on the ground at the time. Sorry, I interrupted Maria.
Something I've been thinking about since you guys did the Children of Time review. You talked about how in the beginning it was science fiction, and later on it sort of became magic with more steps. And I thought about how all throughout the ages, people have sort of defaulted to magic to cover up the gaps in their own knowledge. So these things that seemed like magic to these people were just science not yet discovered. And possibly in the future there will be super intelligent spiders that will descend into space. Just saying.
This is actually a very key
point.
No, you go ahead.
I'm going first. Or magic is used when you cannot explain, because like there are moments where you fall out of love with someone and you're like, I don't even know what I was interested in, especially when you're super close to the falling out of love. Eventually enough time goes back that you can look at it and you're like, I know why it happened and stuff like that. But Henry is one of those people where if he had all questions for, he's so sure in the things he decides that if at any point he questions why he would have done something, there has to be an external explanation. And there's an entire portion where he was like, Shibu, what you mean?
I mean,
I don't, why would I have even been into her?
You're totally right. In real life, you're often like a spiritual answer would be easier of like, God decided to change this, or like, I was bewitched. Because if you don't know about like brain chemicals, you would just be like, yeah, no, I mean, this feels so right in my soul that God told me this was a bad idea and turned off our attraction to each other. So no, I think that's and then that also plays into Henry just being a child.
Yeah, and Henry has also been raised on the myth that he is the prince that was promised, sort of. So, which harkens back to A Song of Ice and Fire. But anyway, he's been raised to believe that everything that he does is ordained. So when things don't go his way, and Cromwell comments on this at one point, so when things don't go his way, he sort of has to look at outside reasons to why things are not working out. Like, why is the fruits of our love not, why don't I get a child? It is my right to have a male child, and who is responsible for this?
I actually really liked...
Since back then, everything was sort of chumped up to the uterus. Like, they had a weird belief in the uterus being responsible for all kinds of stuff.
Trap body if you're not getting sex enough and cause mischief. That is literally a line.
Yeah, it moves around the body. So funny.
If you're not getting dick down enough, the uterus be floating around, causing you to be rebellious. So rebellious women, you just need
some
dick.
Yeah, well, no, and her hostile uterus expelled his fetuses and all sort of things.
Yeah, and so the pseudoscience aspect of it. And I think also what's interesting is the pseudoscience aspect of it is that ambiguity is turned by the characters into what they need it to be and what they want it to be in that moment. And I commented in the first one that I was never quite sure how much Henry believed his own, like, this is spiritually wrong. And I think kind of combined with what Maria was saying a second ago, like, Henry in this one, you really get a sense for, like, he was just socialized to be a child. And also, if you really think you're God's ordained, then, like, yeah, things not going your way is a problem. Like, you fundamentally can't figure out what's going on if you are the King of England and you can't get a son, which you view as important. And also, your needs are, like, the thing that people should care about all the time. Also, side note, I love how cheap Henry is in this book. It's so funny. That resonates with me on a personal level as someone who's really cheap.
When he gives Catherine's necklace to Jane, and Jane served Catherine and was a big fan of Catherine, so she immediately recognizes the gift that Henry gave her. And it's
not just that, he scraped the K off, put an A on it, and then forgot to put a J, and you can still see the K beneath the A. Yo, buddy. What a
shame.
For
shame.
No. Look, sometimes saving money is good.
No decorum.
He's the king. He needs to worry about the finances of the nation. Okay. Also,
he doesn't give a shit about the finances of the nation.
Yes, he does. He just is very cheap.
He only cares if Cromwell tells him that he should.
I think he existentially cares about money. He just doesn't understand it. So, like,
he only understands that he needs to have money.
Yes, yeah. There's almost like a Raven-y kind of like mine kind of feeling about it. And so he's always asking Cromwell these questions about money that, like, he has no idea about, but he just wants more of it. I also loved the line where they were like, "No, go ahead."
There was just one funny time where Henry kind of told of himself, because he was talking about Catherine of Aragon. He was like, "And my wife," and then you could see him catch himself. It was like, "No, that lady that I was for a long time with, who was not my wife."
Yeah. Okay, we should jump into the plot, I think, a little bit, even though nobody's going to watch this. And if you're watching this, you kind of already
Yeah.
know the story. But I think
So
the interesting thing about the beginning of the plot is it's going to just be a good jumping off point for us to talk about Cromwell and where he starts the story and where, like, the political beginnings of the story are in terms of the setup. Because, like I said, we start with Catherine of Aragon is still alive at this point, but like the first fourth of the book is her kind of dying, and it's actually quite
dying.
sad because she is a woman of such. She's such like a battleship of a woman in terms of her faith and her own dignity, and the ways that I think she was dying of like cancer is the feeling I got. It was like stomach cancer, but I don't actually know. And you know, she knows she's dying, so she wants to confess at certain times, and like she's only there's one old lady who was like her one real like handmaiden person who, like, when she hears she's dying, goes to Cromwell and is like, I need to go. And you get the sense that like that's the kind of loyalty she could inspire. She's such a great character.
She really is. And you're completely right. There's multiple characters, including the Ambassador Chapuis, who is
Ooh,
like
my favorite character, by the way. Chapuis is great.
I love Chapuis.
Yeah, Chapuis is awesome.
There's multiple points where he's like, please, can we, like, you know, she has no one. I would like to go be with her because they had been friends previously. And there is just a genuineness about Catherine. And there was a part of me, because there's this duplicity in the faith and design of England that happens over Catherine's life, where she is a queen, and then all of a sudden, are you not a queen and never were a queen? You have been a whore in the sense that you are an unmarried woman having sex with a man and birthing him bastards like that. Like, and against everything that you, as a very, very faithful Catholic woman, everything you would never have done and did not do, thrown against you. And there's this sense of the making and unmaking of the world in a political sense, where they changed the narrative. It's almost like
they changed reality.
Gaslighting.
Yeah,
it was incredibly efficient gaslighting.
Gaslighting. It's like it was just a bunch of narcissists in government, and they were like, no, you don't remember it correctly. That's not what happened. What happened was you weren't a virgin, and you slept with my brother, so it was incest, and so we could never be married, and you've been a whore the whole time. Like, and it's just like, and she's like, but I was there. Like, we did the thing. I was. What are you talking about? And you're just watching this woman kind of like consistently be waterboarded throughout the last 10 years of her life with this shitty, I mean, it's not even, what was it, like 4, I think. So it was 7 years of them trying to get rid of her and being unsuccessful. And then like the last 3 years of her life, she's living in a not great house where all of her ladies in waiting have been taken away from her. It is just people that that Henry and Anne Boleyn are okay with her being around. They separate her from her daughter, who has now gone from being a princess to just a bastard and is called Lady Anne. And it's just this, like, there is a horror. I have it a little bit. I'm watching this show called Severance, and it instills that same kind of like powerless horror at what people in power are able to invent. And when you don't know the full story and you're not in the position, when you don't have the power, how, and it works really well because there's a character who feels very much like a Catherine of Aragon in that show, Harmony Cobell, anybody who's watching Severance. And she's in power, and then she's just completely demoted and abandoned within the context of the show. Spoilers if anybody's starting Severance. Sorry, guys. Sorry. But anyway, and there's this existential dread that this book and that show instills, in the sense of people being able to just completely change the rules. If you think of Thomas More as well as a character who, you know, most of his life, what he did was legal within the context of the society, church.
Yeah, he
king.
was a faithful servant. He did everything that was asked of him within the realms of the law.
And it's
And
also,
then when
like
it
I
was
said,
convenient, he was made into a heretic and a traitor.
it's literally like a shifting of reality. It's literally like
It
if
is.
somebody was like, actually, you're now not 7 feet tall, you're 5 feet tall. And it's like, wait, have I not been? Because the thing is also like your status back then was a lot more important than it is nowadays. Like nowadays we have a much less strict hierarchy, especially back then for like the nobles and stuff. But like literally they're going like your virginity was something that was very important, and they're literally telling you that it's now changed. It's different. And you're like, no, it wasn't. and like, so it's literally like reality is shifting for her, and she is just not accepting it. There's one point where Cromwell tells her like, this is kind of all your fault. Like really, maybe he wouldn't have left the Vatican if you hadn't been so selfish about it, which is interesting in both the sense that like he's correct in that if that's what she really cared about, that's what she would have done. But at the same time,
She could
like
have surrendered gracefully and let the
yes,
marriage fall apart.
but at the same
And gone
time,
to a nunnery.
mm-hmm.
Yeah,
But at
but
the
that
same
would
time,
also have required her to
betray who
renege
she
on
thinks she
everything that
is.
she was owned. Yeah.
Yeah, and
She
also,
was the daughter of a ruling queen.
mm-hmm. It's very true, and it's something where like, yeah, I don't think she. I think she more than Henry has a faith that defies material gain, whereas Henry's faith tends to follow his material gain in a lot of ways. Like the two kind of play easily with each other. Whereas for her, I think she stuck to this thing even because she really believed it. There's a great part where she's like, she wants to see her daughter, but she's like, no, no, no. That is a decision for her to make with her faith. Like it's such an unyielding view of how your child should act. And yet for her, it's very important that her daughter be a moral person and keep to her religious faith. And again, that's why I call it kind of like a battleship. Like she just like she was going down with dignity right till the end.
And it's terrible because when you think about the fact that Henry had to fight to be able to marry her because she was married to his brother, and
she was older than him as well.
And she was older, and the entire fight was, no, actually, she was a virgin. They never consummated the marriage, so I'm allowed to marry her. And then 10, 15, however many years later, he's like, nope, she had sex. Girl's a whore.
She misled me. She said they did not consummate. They did.
And it's just like when I think about Harry Percy. So there's a character that we meet in the first book where when Anne Boleyn is like, don't you want me, Henry? And Henry really wants to get in her pants, which requires a marriage. They need to get Harry Percy to, so before Henry and Anne were an item, Anne was supposed to marry some guy in Scotland or Ireland, and she didn't want to do it. She wanted Henry Percy. And Cardinal Wolsey was like, Papa Boleyn, get your fucking daughter in line. You are beneath the Percys. There is no way on, like, she's marrying that asshole, not him. You best get in. And Papa Boleyn's like, wow, they might have already done it, so I don't know what I can tell you. You know, I can't control what people be doing in this society. And so there was this huge thing that Harry Percy had a claim to Anne, and that they had an engagement, which meant she could not marry Henry. That's like it's you cannot be engaged to someone else and then marry someone else. Like it's a heckin' no. So they had to send Cromwell because Harry Percy was like, no, I was engaged to her. We were supposed to be married. We were doing shit. This is not okay. And Cromwell has to go and threaten Harry Percy's livelihood, existence, financial stability, and get him to swear on a Bible, which at the time, much bigger deal.
Nowadays, we have Supreme Court justices who lie when they're swearing on the Bible. Ooh, political.
Yeah, ooh. And then take communion with the king. Like swear that he never was married, was supposed to marry her. There was no contract. There was nothing going on. And then take communion with the king. So it's like a big deal that he did this. And now Henry's like, Cromwell. But what if Harry Percy lied and like they actually did have a contract? That would mean that my marriage with her wasn't very true, right? That I'm doing this voice because we're constantly told that Henry has a higher pitched voice than you would think looking at him, but also because in my mind he's just a simpering child. He's
Yeah,
like
He is.
he's the worst of Reddit while also being a child. He's like, but like, what if we could get Harry Percy to admit that it actually was a marriage? And Cromwell's like, Henry, I literally got him to swear on a Bible. Like, you made me make him say that. He was saying this thing, but like, and you see Cromwell has to like make and unmake the things. Like he's officially been tasked with making everyone else around Henry follow Henry's fucking delusions. And unfortunately, when you become the arbiter and creator of the narrative and reality of people, you become terrifying. And that is the great, because you just watch Cromwell start. He realizes this is what Henry wants. He gets supporters who are going to help him do this, and he just starts fucking with shit. He starts making people guilty of things that like they're probably not guilty of. So, or guilty, but like not like it
or
shouldn't
probably
be.
more guilty than anyone else.
Yes, not more guilty than anyone else doing it, and he just warps it. And you're watching him do this, and Henry's in the sideline, like, "Yay, you're doing this!" But you know, the day is gonna come where Henry goes, "You warp everyone for me. What if you start doing it for yourself?" And it's just terrifying. And it also makes you hate Cromwell a little because in all the other situations, it does. When he was helping Catherine, like that whole thing, he changed the church in a way that allowed for this to happen. But like Catherine was not killed, or like, and she was given like there was a way that situation was handled, and because it had already the ball had been rolling on that, and he just like got it a ramp so it would slide down easier. He didn't have this huge sense of culpability, and with the Boleyn affair, culpable as fuck, and it's
Well, and
like,
also it gets out of his control because initially the thing is like, oh, we're gonna put her in a convent. Like she'll go into a convent, it's fine. But once he starts like figuring out what's going on or what people are saying is going on, like without it's never mentioned, but it shifts to like, oh no, now she has to die. So it's like where he starts is not where he ends with that affair.
yep.
And the minute we're gonna have a small juicy scandal, and then all the other people are like, "Oh, finally, it's time for our comeuppance." So George Boleyn's wife is like, "Oh, she's been having relations with all sorts of people. You would be you would be appalled if you knew what was going on there. This lad and this lad and that lad, and probably my husband too. They didn't grow up together. They met as adults, and everyone knows it's been known to happen between siblings."
I love her as a character.
So Cromwell's like, do you really mean that? Is that what you want me to write down, ma'am?
Yeah, and she's like,
yep, that's what I want you to write down.
I said what I said. I said what I said.
And then he takes in that stupid boy who's like, "Yeah, I did her. I did her.
I did." So funny.
I did.
And then starts giving any name, and then he just starts pulling because like there's this dumb musician that he gets in, and he just starts naming every name, like all the names of anyone in court that he knows.
Out of his mind by Cromwell. Yeah, so he starts, any single name he can think of. He's just like, this person and this person and this person. Anyone with a cock, anyone who's ever met this boy.
And it's like, and Cromwell's like, okay, I'll take that name. I'm going to ignore that name. I'm going to take this name. And you're watching him do this in this scene, and you're like, oh, Crommy, he is just saying bullshit. Like, he's saying names that are obviously not true, so you can't trust any of the names he's saying. And Cromwell's like, confession, signed, sealed, delivered, baby. And you're like, you weren't one of, in the first book, I was like, he's a good guy. And, you know, sometimes he has to do some bad things to get shit done. But for the most part, he's a good guy. And here you're like, Cromwell, are you one of the bad guys?
He was sympathetic, he was human. You could tell that he often thought that things were paltry, but he did them anyway because he had to. But in this case, you just start seeing him being very lawyery.
Yep.
And that's the worst insult I can think about.
And he also, in the first book, actively tried to save people, even if he was partially the reason that they were now up in a bad position. Like, he wanted Thomas More to live. He was like, just say these things and you'll be okay. And that is not meant to
practically in almost way begged Thomas More to just, you can keep the truth in your heart, just say them out loud.
Say it out
before
loud.
Someone else, and then you can go home.
And in this, that's not, there's literally a point where Boleyn's like, I'll go to a convent. Like, just, can we please end this charade? And he's like, nope, too late. You gotta die.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
You can just see him start pulling out the rope and start tying the knots and like, here, hang yourself with it.
Bringing up the body.
Sorry. And, yep. And also all the like men that he like, and listen, they're not men. Like Harry Norris, I was waiting for Harry Norris to get his teeth kicked in. But like, I didn't necessarily want Henry Norris to die. Like,
I did. But
yeah.
No,
and
yeah, there is
wanted
an
him
outsized
to
sense.
pay for being such a shit towards Wolsey when the train came around for Wolsey.
And like, I love.
And you're like,
Wolsey.
oh, Cromwell, is this the depth of your hatred?
I thought that was interesting.
Do I even know you?
We as a reader are kind of very far away. Like, we hated him in the moment that Wolsey died and he mocked him. But now, like, 20 hours later, to see them get their comeuppance, it feels less satisfying than it would at the moment. And I wasn't quite sure if that's like Cromwell had this depth of feeling and this grudge that we just weren't quite in with as a reader, or if for him it was kind of an after like justification of like, oh, okay, I got to pick some people to die. I'll say it's for vengeance. You know what I mean? Like that kind of a thing. Though he also had practical reasons for picking them.
Yeah,
I got the feeling that he had Harry earmarked for a punishment of some sort, and then this opportunity just fell in his lap, and he was like, "Okay, oh well, that'll do."
Done. You know, like he didn't like, because the thing we're talking about is there are 4 men who, after Wolsey's death.
Yeah, we could go into the end, but the end is when it's all juicy.
Yeah, there are these, and this happened in the first book, but there are 4 men. There's a play after Wolsey's death. There's a play put on at court that is mocking Wolsey, and it is him being pulled apart by these demons. And it's for Cromwell. He's been taken into, in the last days of Wolsey's downfall, he's been taken into Henry's confidence, and Boleyn is relying on him. And so he has come out of this Wolsey situation without a scratch on him, but with all of the feelings. I mean, even in this book, he still thinks of Wolsey, what Wolsey would do, how Wolsey would handle things.
Cromwell
he still tells people to pray
Wolsey.
for Wolsey.
Yep. He loved him.
He wasn't his master. He loved him.
He loved him. And so to watch it, very shortly after his death, this play where Wolsey's being mocked and all the good he's done is just thrown aside, and he goes, Cromwell goes behind the scenes to watch as the 4 men who played the demons ripping him apart take their hats off, and it's Harry Norris, and the 3 other guys whose name I've forgotten. One of them is Weston, and we hate Weston because he was very mean to Cromwell at the beginning of this book. But they played a part in the play, and they are not like, Harry Norris is not the reason Wolsey died. He's not. He absolutely played a part in mocking him and didn't stop it. But as anyone could stop Anne and Henry from doing what they did, like his death Wolsey's death falls on them, and there's a sense that Cromwell has to love Henry, and thus these four men have kind of he's always been pissed off about this, and he didn't like the portrayal.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this point where he's talking, I think it's with Norris, in his interview, and Norris is like, "Why? I don't understand what you're doing." And then he tells him the story. Do you remember the play? You were the hind left paw. And Norris is like, "Oh fuck, you were there. You saw us take," and he realizes that this guy's been carrying. And I agree with Will, where because we're so distanced from the character, you don't realize how much he still fucking hates these assholes. Because there's a point where you think Norfolk and Suffolk are going to, those are the ones, because they actively were part of the administration that brought down Wolsey. And again, they bear none of it. By this point, Brandon and our boy, they're with each other. Cromwell, Brandon, that's the Suffolk, they're fine. They're good. They're all good. And Norfolk is on the part of the court proceedings for all of these motherfuckers getting killed. They were much more actively involved in Wolsey's death. And so you as a reader look at this, and we haven't had the emotional impact to make you root for him in this moment. And I think that's on purpose. I think Mantel is trying to be like, people sometimes hold grudges for the wrong reasons. Because in this moment, you're like, guy, it was 10 years ago. and not just that, but they were in a play about it. And they made fun of him, but they weren't part of any of the policy control. It would be like having something terrible happen and then killing the SNL reenactors.
It reminded me. It's totally that. It reminded me a little bit of
the royal arsewiper who took his chance to have a little bit of fun of someone else's misery.
Yep.
It reminded me a little bit of Martin, A Song of Ice and Fire. No one has to take a drink here because Katie's not here. But where often he'll have characters do awful things, and then you really want them to get a comeuppance, and then when they do get a comeuppance, it's not for the right thing, and it's way out of proportion to what happened, and it just feels more sad and pathetic. He actively denies you the catharsis of a good revenge moment, and this kind of felt like that, where it was like, yeah, right when it happened, we were like, fuck these guys, burn them in boiling oil, and now you're like, they're alone.
My
in the
anger
tower,
was red hot then, but now I've sort of processed it.
And so you're meant to feel it more distantly than Cromwell is, I think.
And also,
and in this moment, you just get a kind of a cold shock, because you're like, he's a cold fish sometimes.
He's such a cold fish. And also, we've seen these characters in so many other scenes since then. Again, I hated Norfolk and Suffolk way more than I ever hated Henry. Now listen, I hated Henry bringing the fucking ring, letting the Cardinal Wolsey kneel before him. Fuck you, Norris.
Just dumb fop.
But I wanted him to get butt ulcers,
or maybe lose his estates or something, get in some kind of scandal, like some kind of scandal like this, but not a kind of scandal where you get executed for treason.
It's just you're like, what the fuck? And so you're shaken. Your love, your faith in Cromwell, in a guy who fundamentally will, even in a situation where he has put you there, like with Thomas More, try save you. And here we have these people who have done way less shitty things than Thomas fucking More. And Cromwell's like, well, you gotta die, buddy. It can be bad or it can be easy. I don't know what you want me to tell you. And I'm like, Tommy, what have they done to you? What have they done to my boy?
It's a game of chess, and he's like, so we've got checkmate in 3, and I'm just gonna throw away these pawns first.
He does it at the beginning of the book. Oh, interesting. There is a chess master at the beginning of the book where he's like, you're gonna get mated in 3. And the guy's like, okay. I forget which character it is. But actually, going back to the beginning, that's when
Jane Seymour's brother.
Is that what it is? Yeah. So actually, at the
Mhm.
beginning of the book, we finally get to Wolf Hall, which was the namesake of the first book. So whatever. But and that's where Henry meets Jane Seymour, who was a little bit in the last book and is more in this one. She is such a hilarious character in a very specific passive way, where like she's really funny for how like deadpan and flat she is about things. Like at one point Henry starts writing her poetry and everybody's like, you gotta tell him, you know, he might send you some poetry, and she goes, okay, and I'll tell him it's good despite the fact that it might not be because of how you know, how impassioned he is about it. Like, I'll forgive that it's not very good. Like there's a lot of
It's gonna be full
subtle...
of lies, but I'm just gonna have to say that that's okay. All poets lie, so you know, it's great.
Or like, does he have to do this
It's
or
funny.
that?
Everyone talks over Jane's head like she is stupid, and she gives these really dry remarks that are just so pointed.
And biting. Like, and there's a point where you're like, Jane's fucking smart. And same, her sister Bess gets a couple of lines, and there's literally a point where Bess impresses Cromwell so much, he was like, maybe I'll marry her.
Yeah.
Like, damn. Bess, you got a mind on you.
There's also a point where
it's
I think it's the same scene. I think where Jane says something like really intelligent, and he's like, "Their bed would have been cold, but he would have married her in that moment," or something like that. Like she challenges him in a mental way.
They would have been peers.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe he should have married her when he had a chance.
And it's crazy because there's this sense that like the things to value about Jane or Bess are not the things that other people are valuing. Like Henry doesn't value her because she's smart. Because there's this point where specifically Cromwell says he thinks she's stupid, and that appeals to him because Anne was smart, but that's not the case. Jane is smart. The difference is Anne's loud about it and manipulative and cunning, and she is playing the game of chess with you. Jane Seymour is not playing. She's not playing against you, but she is commenting on your choices and your decisions in the background. But Henry doesn't care about that. Henry just cares about what is happening, the difficulties he has to face on a day-to-day basis. And so he's like, she's not going to say anything.
Yeah, he's had a woman who's challenged him, and you know, it's a lot of hassle. Like, oh my god, she is so much work, and she doesn't even pop out suns for me. But here's Jane. She doesn't say anything at all, and she's good, pious Christian woman.
Mm-hmm.
How could God not love it if I dipped into her?
And there's literally this hysterical point where he writes her a letter. And he gives it to Cromwell, and Cromwell's like, you might need to be a little bit more, you need to add a couple sentences. So he adds a couple of sentences, and Jane won't read it. Like, she's like, she's like, I'm not playing this game. Because she's been told by everyone, you do not give yourself to him, do not give him too much. Like, because her entire family is like, we get rid of Boleyn. We put Jane on the throne, and then we're the Boleyns, baby. Ha-cha-cha. And Jane's just there like, well, I know what I'm gonna, like, she hears what everyone tells her, and she plays it, but she specifically, it's such an excellent moment where she gets this letter. She won't read it because her is good, pious girl, but she kisses the seal and then sends it back. And Henry's like, oh my God, this woman of piety. You're correct. Everyone's correct. I won't see her alone. I will only see her amongst her family. I can't. Gosh, she must have been so embarrassed. I've been behaving like a brute. And it's like, okay. And but it's just, I love Jane, and I wish there was more Jane, because there's Jane in the beginning, and then we never see her. There's several characters I love that we see a bit in the beginning, and then they're just fucking gone, and we're just left with the worst of the cast, as is in the people that are the most pains in the dick.
It's true.
People just being shitty towards each other because they're in this power struggle. Whereas I would have really liked just more funny scenes of Jane being awesome. Just Jane slaying.
Yes!
She's so funny. It's and it's also funny that like how little she's attracted to Henry. Like she clearly gets the sense that she's going along with this, but it's not like she herself is attracted to Henry's magnetism, which he does have.
Let's be fair. At this point in Henry's life,
well,
there wasn't
before
that
you
much
say anything,
left to be attracted
before
to,
you say
except
anything,
that he was the king.
Before you say anything, this is a fat positive space, this podcast. So Henry is still very attractive by this point. Thank you very much. We don't age shame and we're body positive.
I meant the fact that he had a wound that was ever festering, that must have smelled like all hell, and that he only ever cares about what he wants.
To be clear,
what
again,
women want.
We respect the differently abled in this space. So again, I would, you know what I mean? People with lifelong injuries are still attractive, Lindbergh. But yeah, no, the thing about it's Jane too that and that's one of the things that strikes me about Mantel as an author, when she is extremely funny, but also her characters are funny in different ways and have different voices, which is something that you often find, to be honest, just with a lot of the romantasy books we've read, where like characters all banter like they're the same person, and it becomes really tiring really fast.
Or in The Lies of Locke Lamore as well.
Yeah.
Everyone makes the same kind of quips.
And they're good jokes, but in that's actually probably a better one, because the jokes in that one tend to be funnier, but they're actually, again, there's too many people with the same voice. That was one of the things, is like all the voices in this book are very distinct, not just because the narrator is so good. Maria got a different narrator this time because she needed him to be understandable, but I went back to the original narrator who chooses his.
So before Ben, the narrator he's excellent. I love him. He's the one that chooses the scenes, and he like adds the dramatic pauses. Yeah, Ben Miles. Excellent. Fantastic narrator. I struggled just listening to him. For Ben Miles, I have to read and listen at the time. I don't know why. How pleased I was to find that Simon Vance, the guy who did the Temeraire books, previously, yes, and so
I didn't know that.
He's excellent. His voices are great, and it's so funny because once I got used to his voice for Cromwell, the other voices are really good. Like he does a really good job. Like his Henry is particularly
plaintive,
childlike, and annoying in some ways, and so I actually really liked, and especially the scene with him and Catherine before her death. Excellent. He was great, and so I switched to him because I can listen to Simon Vance and just read the stuff, and especially now that our girl Mantel decided to clarify who the he is in confusing scenes. I was able.
Fine. Yeah. He Cromwell.
It literally, because she goes
3 times.
Dash. He Cromwell. Dash. It is so funny to see it. But I was able to listen to this book, where in the last one I had to also read it, or just read it to be able to get through it. So it was great. I was able to get through this one much easier.
One thing I will say about that, actually, just really quickly, the he thing, it actually shows how good of a writer Mantel is, that she actually listened to that. She actually seems to know, like, okay, what is my audience getting? What are they not? Again, the note at the end of the book, I was like, oh, she knows real scholars are reading this and interacting with the history of it. Like, as a writer, she has a very specific vision that is not for everyone, but at the same time, she's not arrogant enough to not pay attention to the reader experience. And I think that's
so
something
much care goes into her wanting for the reader to receive the message.
And I think that goes underrated.
Above her own ego.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, you're saying, Maria?
Another thing I really love about this book is it kind of works against. So there's this like long-held belief, and it is true in some portions of history, but this like long-held belief that you had old men with like very young women. And one of the things I like about this is it also shows you that that's like not always what was happening, guys. All like Catherine, older woman, Anne Boleyn was like 28, and our girl
Jane Seymour.
Jane is like 26, and dies at like 28, 29. They're married for a year and a half, 2 years. She has a kid.
I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
I don't want her to
and so like all of these women are older. And then we also are introduced to another dynamic that happened that people forget about, because sometimes girls were married very young, but they didn't go and have sex with the people they were married to. We're given a clear example of that in this book where
Henry's
bastard, Richmond, is married to Norfolk's niece, daughter, or something. And they haven't been living together because they got married at like 12. You know, like they were both too young, and they were like, nah. And now he's 16. Because he comes up to Cromwell and he was like, I've met a woman. I'd like to sleep with my wife now. I'd like to live with her and have my own house. And he's like, okay, I'll talk to, and so there's this, because it's just like a lot of times when I hear people kind of defending older men being into very young women, they were like, well, historically,
and a woman's prime fertility is in her 15th and her 16th year. That is when the uterus is most ripe to bear a fruit.
What's that voice?
But even back then, it's the tone of the stupidity. That's what that is.
It's
it's fully true.
The body isn't fully grown and isn't fully developed and fully ready yet. So that's why they kept the kids apart.
Well, and also it's not just fundamentally true that all men are attracted to younger women. Like they like to act like that because it's an essentialist position. But again, Henry was very into Catherine before he realized she couldn't have sons or whatever.
Yeah, and Cromwell several times is like, oh, maybe I should have married Jane, but I'm so much older. Like, I could be her father.
And he's like, not really. And it's crazy because there was a point where I was like, ew. But then I realized, so she's 26, so it's not terror. Like, it's not. I don't love it.
She's not 17. Yeah, no.
She's not 17 because there's a point where I thought she was like 19, and I was like, Cromie, my boy. And then I was like, oh, she's 26, 27.
Okay, at this point, Maria's being very kind.
She's a fully adult woman.
Yeah.
Maria's being very kind. This is the point where I text her, I know it's wrong, but I ship them. And she was like, gross. And then we looked up her age, and it was like, oh, okay, that's fine. Because part of it is the narrator kind of acts like she's 15.
My response to that was, you old perv.
Yes!
I stand by it. They have such a great intellectual, repartee. I'm also into him and Bess. I'm also into Lady Rochford.
I think she should have married Gregory, and he would have been her father-in-law, and they could have been confidants and family.
Yes, awesome. I like that, and I don't mind because Bess is her older sister, so I think she's in her 30s, and that I'm okay with. Something that I don't think has been brought up on this channel, but my moms have a 21-year age gap. The younger one was in her 30s, and the other one was in her 50s. So I've seen two people with a big age gap. For me, the difference is my mom was a fully developed human who had lived a whole life before that and knew who she was and what she wanted. And my other mom
they're adults
also,
who met.
And they also
they're
were
already
in similar
sinning
points
against God, so it's okay.
Yeah, but they also knew who they were, and they're absolutely fucking adorable. And they both also were in similar points in their lives. They just had divorces, so they were working women, newly divorced, figuring out shit. And so they were in similar life stages. So I'm okay with so please don't think that I'm age gaps forever. I'm just they're babies. When they're babies.
I think it's also there's also that when you meet when they're too young, the older person can shape the younger person, which is bad because of just the power dynamics.
The older person has psychological
power
hold on the younger person.
Yep.
Psychological power with the younger person, and they often have a position in life where they are more stable. They have more power.
And I think the other
thing, not the age gap itself.
Yes.
I think the thing is also that in fiction, this is easier than in real life because in fiction, characters kind of exist in a static state of age to begin with. And they also tend to two characters it's sort of like the thing where teenagers will not actually act like teenagers in fiction a lot of the time, whereas now me thinking about dating someone in their early 20s, which is only a 10, if they were 24, it's a 10-year age gap. I'm 34 right now. I'm but would they get my millennial jokes? Would they have a certain amount of like maturity in the way that I expect people to have emotional maturity and self-regulation? Like that's actually a big gap for me now. I wouldn't just be like, ooh, she's hot. But in fiction, like, you know, characters can have any emotional maturity at any age. And I think that is just one of these fundamental things. I was talking to Maria before this about how I kind of want to write a book about how fiction doesn't match up to reality in certain just fundamental functional ways. But like this is one of those things that in fiction you're like, yeah, in my head I see Cromwell and her and they interact well. You don't really think about the ways that Cromwell's like, well, you know, I want to stay in for the night, you know, so, or something like that.
No, but
the way that Cromwell is probably going to be dead in 10 years.
Yeah,
because people died young.
Yeah,
like he's on the latter back half. But yeah, I mean, listen, there is a chemistry of intellectualism between them, and it's why I like Bess. I was like, I like Bess Cromie, but like again, Cromwell is just completely uninterested in remarriage. It's not on his docket.
How he thinks of his wife and how her memory is fading, and he so loved her in a way that like he really loves the formative people in his life, like Wolsey and her, and he dislikes that they're and that's. Yeah, his daughters. He never forgets his daughters. I think, it's so beautiful because in a lot of books, like somebody gets a sprained ankle and they forget about it like 3 pages later. Like there's a lack of object permanence.
Someone's spouse gets fridged, and it's
yes.
They just remember the person as a kind of motivator for them to be angsty and angry.
Mm-hmm. Or it gets wiped out, and it's like, no, in real life, you never really forget that you lost a child. You lost 2 children, and you lost your wife. And that's part of the reason I think this book also feels a little bit more melancholic, is it's also Cromwell kind of thinking about how history eats everything. He thinks about that, especially towards the end. But going back to the plot, if that works for you guys?
Yes.
Okay, so basically the other big thing that's set up in the first half of this book is that Anne has kind of, I don't know how much of this is her and how much this just happened, but she has kind of found herself without friends in that her and Cromwell are kind of on the outs. She doesn't quite trust Cromwell. Cromwell knows she doesn't quite like him. Her and Henry just finds her to be a lot at this stage. He kind of like doesn't love how driven she is anymore. And also she just keeps not having sons for him, which is a problem. Politically.
Get it together, Anne.
And you do get the strong sense that Anne isn't really enamored with Henry either. She thinks he's rather tedious.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. There's this sense that, again, these people were, it's kind of that trope you see in fiction. I mean, and I think it happens in real life where once the relationship comes out of secrecy and like is no longer illicit or bad, like, people lose the spark because they're more obsessed with the idea of the relationship than the actual other person. Now, is 7 years a very, 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 very long time for you to come out of that and be like, wow, we slept together and it wasn't what I thought. And now I find you quite annoying. Yeah.
I never noticed before.
You've always been kind of a bitch, haven't you, Anne? And she's always been like, you've been kind of a dumb child, Henry. Like, and you're just sitting there like, guys, this was all very apparent before.
Yeah.
What those rose-colored glasses were thick and dark, boy, and you just got them taken off all at once.
I think this also speaks, though, to how important having a son is politically and spiritually, honestly, for Henry. Is like, no, this is really important. She can't deliver. I think though it's never stated, I've always assumed that whole 7 years he was like part of her temptation and attraction was she can give me a son, because again they don't seem to think about this as a biological.
Part of her temptation was a fresh womb to plant his seed in.
Right, and I think he really believed that there was something wrong with Catherine. Which I'd always assumed was a kind of a very women-blamey thing, which it is, but also, again, you get a sense for how spiritual these people are, and Henry in particular thinks he is England, and England is him, and he is God's disciple.
Yeah, and they did believe that a woman's uterus was the deciding factor in whether there was a child or not, and some women could just have sour, mean uteruses that didn't want the seed to take root.
Yeah, I think Mantel does a really good job balancing that superstition with the slut shaminess and misogyny of the era. So it's like, okay, we're not excusing one, but we are explaining it a little bit more and adding a little nuance and the motivations behind it. And then the other thing is she's kind of been pissing off her family, Norfolk, the what is her name? The Boleyn, like, patriarch. She like kind of wants power in her own right. We talked last time about how her uncles had kind of whored out her sister Mary in a way that like left Mary very scarred and not really having any of the fruits of her labor. Like they essentially sold out their daughters without giving them, I talked about it like in a capitalistic socialist sense. They were alienated from the fruits of their labor. Like they had surplus value essentially that their uncles were just taking. And this time
It took away the little value she ever had.
Right, and in this case, Anne is like, no, you're not in charge anymore. I'm in charge. I'm the king's daughter. And so, like, Norfolk, her uncle, is not that happy with it. Or not, queen. And then also, and again, there's Cromwell, there's the king, there's them. And then also we find out that the old British families are not happy at these upstart French Boleyns getting all this power. And they're also pretty Catholic still. And they don't like having lost their power in there. There's also an interesting contrast where the populace views Anne Boleyn as a foreign French woman, where they viewed Catherine as English, even though she was Spanish, which I thought was very interesting.
Not just that, she was royal. There's this idea of her being a royal princess that came to them. She had while not being English, she had the inherent value of also coming from a ordained, godly, royal position. And Anne is literally a French no one. Like,
glorified merchant's daughter.
Yes. And that is and there's even a point where they talk about how some of the populace are like, why won't King Henry marry another European princess? Why can't, that's what we do. We bring in the beautiful young princess from over there. We're like, oh, wow, she's this king's
royalty
thing.
are magical unicorns. They should procreate with each other.
Why are we having our magical unicorn king procreate with not another? Like, there's so many. They're out there. We can just ask Europe, please send us a magical unicorn lady. And they're not doing it. And the people are like, we like when, because it's fanfare. There's this doesn't go into it, but historically there is something to be said for a royal wedding, baby. For bringing in the princess from another. She comes, she walks down, she has a procession, people come into the streets, and they're like, oh my God.
Excitement of seeing things from so far away.
Yep. And this princess has traveled from so far, and she's come, and now they're going to, it's a thing, and like, and then the wedding is a big thing, and people celebrate in the streets, and they come and look in the chapel, and watch it. Like, it's a whole huge ass thing. And he just married Anne Boleyn.
And the thing is also that I talked last time about the need for kings of this era to perform kingship in a way that was very visible, because otherwise it's just a house of cards. He doesn't actually have any, it's not a democracy. There's no legitimacy to it. He has to seem like a king to rule like a king. And so, and part of that is marrying somebody royal, getting that legitimacy of someone cool. And the big, marriage as an act to kind of bind the kingdom together. And so they just kind of look down on her, Boleyn, for that. So she's also politically kind of in a tenuous spot. And then, again, I think the big turning point is she can't have a son. If at any point she'd had a son, I think none of this would have been a problem. But she has a miscarriage, I think it is.
Yes, there's a point, and this is such a great scene because it's such a terrifying moment. And it's not going to be a thing, but I will give Mantel, she's able to play with your expectations where even though you know that what she's about to do isn't actually going to happen, and it is still a very tense scene because of the realization Cromwell has. And what happens is during a jousting tournament, the king is, his horse gets spooked and he's thrown off and everybody thinks he's dead. They held the feather and the mirror up to his lips, no movement, nothing. They're like, oh my God, the king is dead. Cromwell's like, oh, fuck. the king's dead. That's all my power, baby. And the realization, and this 10-minute or 2 hour, I forgot how long it is, but he talks about how time dilated weird, and he's not even sure what it was, but that there's a whole period where they're not sure what the lay of the land is. Do they need Mary, Princess Mary? Do they need Richmond, his son? The infant Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, useless. You know, it's Princess Mary or Richmond, the king's bastard that everybody knows is his son. Like what? And if we're Mary's a bastard currently. So if we have to pick, maybe like there's this whole machinating sense of, and I need to get in. Cromwell has this moment of, how am I going to maintain? And everyone is just looking at the situation and being like, what the fuck do we do? And it really puts into perspective how important it is to have a strong and unargued expectation for succession. And it's something that I wish House of the Dragon played with a bit more, in the sense, because it does. There's literally characters who are like, no, Rhaenyra's got not, like there's a bunch of things about this, but this moment of panic is so excellent, because that's inherently the whole problem of House of the Dragon is this problem that England is facing, as Henry Tudor is not fucking having sons that are official, that have a claim to the throne. And it's an excellent scene, but the hearing about his death, Anne is so, because you're fucked, Anne. You didn't have a son. Mm-hmm. And she's pregnant at this time, and it's such a shock. And you don't know if this is correlated. You don't know if it's causation, but it is correlated. She miscarries, and it was a male, a boy child that they see. And it is this terrible moment of like this failure of a thing that probably caused by people rushing in and telling her, when they shouldn't have, that her husband was dead and that, you're not queen anymore. And it's this terrible moment, but it really is like nail in the coffin out of this, because she has nothing after this.
I think it's also the point where Cromwell realizes that if she hasn't had a son, and so she is now untenable as a political venture. Like, I think this is the point too where he kind of skips ship and is like, okay, we got to move on. Because before this, he had kind of brought in Jane Seymour as like the king's paramour. And it's really interesting because there's a point where like he's like, well, it's fine for Jane Seymour to be his paramour though, because Henry does not hold grudges. He's always extremely nice to women he's slept with. He doesn't seem to actually, like, there's a way that Henry is a child and a misogynist, but he is always very nice to women who he's slept with afterwards and gives them like, endowments and whatnot. So he's like, okay, I'll bring in Jane and that can be a good kind of side piece for him. But I think this is the moment where he goes like, okay, I can't really hitch my horse to this thing that is maybe not going to work out.
Yep. And so it is a very big plot point, and it is after this that people start coming to him, because there's literally a point where he's like, I'm going to bide my time until other people will come to me to deal with this problem. So nobody will be able to say I started it. Other people will come and then I will fix it. I'm the fixer for them. And that's what happens. Some of the Will mentioned, like the old established English families are like, fuck the Boleyns, and it's also a tension, because something we haven't mentioned is Boleyn was the reformist queen. Mm-hmm. She was a religious reformer. She was here for the non-Catholic Christianity, baby. She supported it.
She was fighting for the Bible being translated into English, so normal people could read it.
And that's something that Cromwell has personally. He is a reformist. He is personally much more Lutheran in his beliefs than he was Catholic, to the point where somebody calls him that, and he has to, like, he pretends he isn't, but he is. He knows, like, it is what it is. And so he has to go against, and this is one of those moments where you're like, oh, Cromwell, you are really you're the way you're looking at this is so specific that you know that helping these other people means that Catholicism could get a bit of a hold. And he kind of is in the thing like, the train's gone too far. It's not going to go backwards kind of thing. But it was a risk he made in backing these very Catholic people. And also, there is no love from the new, and that's going to be part of the downfall. And you're watching it happen. These people who come to him and say, we want to get rid of Anne Boleyn, they don't like Cromwell. They know he's a reformer. They are very Catholic. And once Cromwell has done what he needs, and even he knows, they will cast him aside and he's just going to have to keep hitching his horse to the king. And this is not friendships. This is not, and so this entire Boleyn affair is just chaos as he ties himself to these people who don't like him personally, religiously. And you're just like, no, Crommy, don't do this.
You kind of forgot how this power block is
mutual usury.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's one of these things that, like, you can. Cromwell sees the noose tightening about himself, but he's also grown. I don't want to say arrogant, but he's like, this is a calculated risk that I'm willing to take. And to be fair, up until this point, Henry has been very, he does seem to have a bond with him that is at the same level as Wolsey's, if not, I think Cromwell thinks more, because Cromwell is actually even running the country more. I mean, the thing is that after, spoiler alert for history, Henry kills Cromwell or hasn't died, he'll often say how he shouldn't have done that, like how he still needs Cromwell. And so from a practical point of view, killing Cromwell makes absolutely no sense for Henry. And it's a really dumb thing to do. The next part is that essentially he meets up with some people. Oh yeah, he speaks to the ladies in waiting of Anne Boleyn, because at this point Henry has had a dream. Henry has fucking dreams about like how she Anne Boleyn like used charms and potions on him to make him love her, and he doesn't think that it's sitting right with God, and he's like, okay, go fix this. And Cromwell's like, okay, well maybe we can get her into a nunnery. And so he starts collecting gossip from her maids and stuff, and this is where it comes out that like there's a Henry Wyatt, I think is it, that's the poet that he gets off later. I forget his name. Help me out.
Oh yeah. Wyatt, Thomas Wyatt.
Thomas Wyatt at one point, who had been kind of like a flirter of Anne, had said that Anne does this thing where she'll make you think that there's a bunch of other people that like her. And this, I think, is one of the key ideas that Mantel has, is that Anne is very good at doing that, and making other people kind of jealous of her. But what that creates is a situation where everybody thinks, in this case, she's adultering with somebody else. So he'll never be able to get a confession from somebody that they were adultering with her, but they'll all say, oh, I know for sure that guy was doing it. Like, and so that to me, I think, is how she threads the needle of, is this true or not? Is like, maybe, but also she kind of just created this, not to victim blame or anything, but like this is kind of where those rumors come from.
Yeah,
because there are rumors now that.
Finish. Sorry.
Because there are rumors now that she, like, she had a spat with one guy who she said loved her, and then he was like, "Why did you say that? That's way too true." And like other moments like that within her court. I got the sense personally from reading this that, like, yeah, she was having a lot of affairs. Like, that was kind of the feeling I got, even though, again, I think the book is much more has less of a specific stance on it than that.
I got the feeling that she wasn't necessarily having a lot of affairs, but maybe there was a few that were happening. And again, I just like, that's what monarchs did. Like,
no, they
throughout history. Yes, they did. The king was fucking around with people. The queen, like,
yes. The queen can't, because it's really important that her child. There's that one lady, I forget her name, who like is running into a really difficult political spot because she did have an affair, and her husband kind of knows this isn't his son. Like, it's a very unfair standard, and there are definitely women at court who are having affairs. And one of the funny things about this is everybody keeps sending each other money as gifts, and it's like a weird like social thing that you just send people you like money to be
money.
Cool. But like in this case, it's actually really important that the political line, because that's one of the other things is like Elizabeth is so ugly. Everybody's like, that can't be a king's daughter. I'm like, what is going on? She's such a dwarf. She's so ugly.
But they said the same thing about Mary. Like but
Mary the talking shrimp.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that there's so this is a really good argument for why lines need to go down matrilineally. We in the Cushiel book we read, there was that one, the Scottish culture, where you had kings, but their sisters were the ones that gave you heir, because at least you knew 100% for certain that
I say
that
go
was
the
of
Byzantine
your
method.
line.
Byzantine method. It has to be somebody in the family, but you get to pick who the heir is. You then tend to get a lot less terrible monarchs. But anyway, if you want to go with your feminist supremacist version.
It's not necessarily that, but like the only
I
guarantee that it is of your bloodline is to, like, if you have a sister, be like, okay, give me a baby. I 100% know that that's my fucking nephew. We watched it. That's him.
It popped out.
Like, it popped out. It always was hysterical to me that we were like, don't have sex, women.
Look,
just don't do it. Like, that's a risk. Why are we taking it?
It is funny because you then have to have all these social controls to make sure, but you're never actually going to be sure before paternity tests.
Nope.
Yeah. No, it's true. But what had happened then at that point is that so Cromwell starts getting evidence, and this is where it comes out that maybe she had sex with her brother, which again he is like shocked by, but a bunch of other people are like, it kind of makes sense. They're not really raised together, and they like kind of like they're kind of like each other. People have done this before. It's not unthinkable.
They met as adults.
But also, the craziest part is, if she has a child that looks like her and her brother, nobody's gonna question that. That's the only way. The point that Will was making with that the other Boleyn girl, that whole logic of if you need a son and you're gonna have an affair, you better either do it with someone who looks like your husband or someone who looks like you. So you
didn't work out for Lannister.
Take away yet another opportunity for them to say that maybe this isn't my child. It needs to seem as much of their child as possible.
Unless
they're like, it would make sense for her to diddle her brother.
Unless you're part of the Baratheon line, and then you have the problem that their eyes are always blue when they marry Lannisters. Am I right? Yeah.
Well,
you should get that joke.
Actually, never mind. I'm gonna do that fact-checking thing and explain how genetics work. Never mind.
In A Song of Ice and Fire, that's how it works. For some reason, eye color just triumphs over other non-eye color, which is very funny because it's an important plot point. But also, Martin messes up what color eyes Baratheon has at one point in the book. So, like, he clearly was not paying that much attention to it. But anyway, that's not important to this. But yeah, and so again. No, you go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to continue with the plot, which you're doing a great job on.
No, you go ahead with.
Slaking.
Do the next
but yeah, so he starts getting these things. He's kind of shocked. And he starts putting together like a narrative of what happened. And he's like, okay, I need to start talking to some guys. And the first guy he goes with is Mark, the musician, who has been a character he has not liked since book one, because Mark said shit about him in Flemish. And
quite possibly Mark likes it up the butt.
Yes, quite possibly. And so he gets Mark, and they kind of hold Mark hostage a little bit. They don't do anything to him, but they lock him in a room with the Christmas supplies, and he freaks himself out, and he comes out.
And the living Jesus out of the poor boy.
Oh my God. And so the next day he comes out, and he's like, this person slept with her, and this person slept with her, and this person slept with her. Because at first he kind of
he's like, no, she's only slept with me.
Yeah, but not just that, but like he's like, she loves me, she's with me. Of course, the king's upset because she's in love with another. She's in love with another man, and then he almost outs Norris and another guy because he says something in a way that, and because at first Cromwell's like, oh, we're just trying to make them happy, like we're trying to make the queen happy. She doesn't seem happy, and he's like, of course, she's in love with me. She's in love with someone else, and they're like, oh my God, what you see? And the idea you have is Mark's kind of full of shit. Like, I don't believe Mark But there's this point where he realizes that no, they're not actually trying to make the queen happy. They're trying to get dirt on her. And because literally they were like, oh, so Norris and this other person slept with her. And he realizes, oh no, they did me a hacking trick. I've said too much. And he starts trying to go back on it. They lock him in the room. He comes out and he's like, yes, everybody slept with her. If it's a man and it has a penis and it was near her, it's been there.
My dead granddad fucked her.
Yeah, everyone. And it's just this like, and so then he starts pulling together his prime list of suspects, and there's 4 names that guy said that are within that are close to the queen that he has, and he decides to pick the 4 devils that ripped apart Wolsey, and everybody's like, you kind of have to do Thomas Wyatt. Like you have to, like, that guy's got to be there too.
Everyone knows he did her, sort of.
Yeah, and everyone knows that he was fucking in love with her. Like, you can't interview all these other guys without him. And Cromwell's like, but I like that guy. I don't want to do it. And so he has to kind of like pretend. He has to pretend like he takes him into the tower, but doesn't actually like have any intention of like looking into it for anything. And but even Wyatt is like, I don't think this is the thing you're making it out to be, Cromwell. And it's just really wild. And there's a couple of good conversations here where the men realize what is happening and that regardless of the truth, it's not going to change what's happening. And so a lot of them just have to choose, especially the ones that have sons and or have children, have wives that want them to be taken care of.
The order of them from a literary point of view or from a writing craft point of view is really clever because we start, I don't remember any of their names. We start with
Norris.
One guy who...
Mark. We start with Mark.
Mark, who is very pathetic. Like, he is very much almost the everyman of, like, I found myself in this position. This is not good. I didn't do it. And that's when he has the moment of, like, I mocked Wellesley once and I don't even remember, my dude. Like, what are you doing? It starts with a very, like, clearly this guy is kind of innocent and it doesn't matter. The next guy he goes to is a bad dude who's like just like there's a variation between each of the 4 of them, and that's kind of nice because it becomes a non-repetitive scene. The next guy is like some Welsh lord or something like that who definitely murdered somebody else and never got punished for it, and he's like just unapologetic. He knows this whole thing is political. And then the last guy, who's the last guy? I don't know. But I just remember the way that they progressed was very clever in terms of how each one adds a little bit more to the story. And kind of it comes out more.
Oh,
and the thing,
George.
George,
the brother?
Boleyn.
Yeah, George Boleyn was the last one.
Who is like...
He was last. Before him, it was Charles Brandon, wasn't it?
Charles Brandon is Suffolk, the Duke of Suffolk. So it's Weston, I don't know if his name is Weston, but that like asshole guy from the beginning, Norris, Boleyn, and then a 4th dude.
I'm going to be honest. Again, I don't remember their names. I just remember, unfortunately, I don't actually highlight as I go because this is an audiobook. This whole podcast would be 30% more literary if I just read these because I could highlight things as I go.
I keep thinking I should just jot down notes, but I'm always reading when I'm working and doing other things, so I never actually do.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's just one of the realities of the podcast is, like, to get through these books once a week, like, I have to listen to them while I'm doing, like, other stuff. But anyway, and the other thing is at this point you get the sense that Cromwell, and because I think Cromwell just outright says it, like, he just...
Norris,
these men are
William
guilty.
Brereton. Sorry, I got them. It's Henry Norris, William Brereton. He's the one that killed the person, like that guy.
Mm-hmm.
George Boleyn, and then Francis Weston's the last guy.
Okay. Yeah, and at this point, Cromwell is like, well, look, I got to find guilty men, and these are men who are guilty of something. These are my political enemies, and they're not great. And I think there's 2 things here. One, there's a saying that you should never let a disaster go to waste, which is basically like, okay, if a hurricane goes through an area, use it politically. You didn't create the hurricane, but use it to advocate for, like, less regulations or more regulations or changing it to be, like, everybody having a green whatever. What are you holding up?
Sorry, I'm resetting my white balance.
Oh, I was like, is that an example of it? But anyway, and so I kind of see Cromwell in this moment doing that, which is like, okay, this happened. If somebody has to die, it might as well be somebody useful to die. But at the same time, I think the difference between it kind of goes to what you were saying, Maria, which is that in the first book, he was making the best of a bad situation that he didn't start, whereas he never quite takes responsibility for this one in that he did start this. He started this, and this is of his making. And so it's not a disaster in the sense of an act of God. It's like, you're being practical about it now, but this is your fault, so to speak. Like,
Yep.
you are helping Henry do this.
The culpability
Doing
of this,
a lawyer.
and the thing is, there are other ways he could have done this. Like, there's no reason when those ladies in waiting told him that stuff that he had to go, okay, we're going this route. Like, if you think about it,
he didn't have to go with, oh, so it's incest, and it's multiple infidelities, and it's treason.
He didn't have to do that at all. He could have gone to Anne and been like, yo, I have this, I can show it to Henry, he will believe it, or you can join a nunnery. Like, these are your, like, when she realizes she has no cards, she says, I'll go to a nunnery. Like, he handled this in such a way where, like, you're right, he takes no culpability. And there's this, like, I don't want to say a sense of glee, but like the sense of, I'm not stopping the train. Like, I could, but I'm not. Yeah. And I'm going to use this to benefit myself, you know. And again, like, it just, it's just
kind of like Anne has become his adversary. He's like, I'm going to defeat her completely because I can.
And it just, and take down the Boleyns, because I'm also getting rid of George fucking Boleyn, and like these people that he doesn't like. But like Harry Norris, while being an asshole to him, has done good and has been a very good friend of the king, like his whole life. There's something fundamental. And also what you're also doing is you're showing Henry he can't trust anyone. If he can't trust the guy that he grew up with from the age of 6, who can he trust, Crommy? Why is he going to trust your machinating fixer-ass?
It's the beginning of the cycle of breaking down Henry's confidence in the people around him that will inevitably land Cromwell himself in shit, because Henry has become paranoid. Like, everyone betrays me, everyone's against me. Even you. It's tout brute.
Yeah, you're creating the situation for your eventual fall, even as you think you're not. And there's also a monetary aspect to this and a political aspect in that, like, he talks a lot about, like, the loot, almost in, like, a war sense of, like, these people who die, their property has to go somewhere, their titles have to go somewhere. And so, like, he has one guy who writes to him being like, I think I should take this over because I have a cranky wife and 11 kids. I don't think what it was, but it was something like that. And so, like, there is and the other thing is, again, one of the things I really like about Mantel is that all of this is kind of in a bit of an ambiguous state. So, like, it's not black and white, who deserves to die and who doesn't, and why he's doing this and why he doesn't. It's messy in the way that real history is messy and real politics are messy. And have many
probably no one decided to die. No one deserved to die in this case, and Henry should just have gotten an annulment some other way.
Yes, and that's the crazy thing. Or someone should have been like, Henry, you're the fucking king. This church, like, this entire religion is based off. You're supposed to have one wife, and you're like, can you relax, my dude? But he was coddled so much. But you're right, Will, it really is just messy in the way that history is messy, because there's a part of me narratively that I'm like, it doesn't make sense for the Cromwell we saw in book 1 to do this. It doesn't. But he did. Hims did do it. Like, he did a lot of good for the world. He wanted to support civil works projects, get the poor building roads, bridges, infrastructure, like the thing we did to get out of the Great Depression in the U.S. in the 19
even religiously 40s. Like, I don't really know that much about Catholics versus Protestants, but like, or Anglicans, but like in the world of this book, like, they are a much more liberal, better religion than Catholicism at that time in that place. I know this is very controversial to say now here in America,
but let people read the thing in their own language. Like, I get it. I also get the problems with translations. We deal with that right now. Translations are doing wildly different things.
I also love the part where he's like, the Catholics think that the toenails of Christ can continue to grow, like shrine, like relics can continue to grow, and then other places can get them, just in a completely scientific way, so they can continue to sell more of them. And going back to it though, but and the other thing I think is that, and I told this to Maria while somebody was late for us to get to the recording, is that there is this is the best reading of the evidence we have of what Cromwell did. Like, he actually in real life may have tortured people, and that actually, not even just may, like that may actually be more likely than what we're seeing here. And so this is still the best case version for him, but you can see the ways that, yeah, this is messy in the way that politics and humans and systems are.
Yep. And it also speaks to that thing that we talk about sometimes in the podcast, where we look at a book and we say, you know, like, that's not really believable within like the confines of this story, where there's that verisimilitude, where your ability to believe something, whether it could have actually happened in reality, is absolutely not consequential to a discussion of verisimilitude within a story. But in this case, she has to play within the confines of reality, especially with how Mantel has chosen to write this series, and all the ways Will has mentioned, where, you know, she's not rewriting the bits so that you get the more cathartic scenes or the more impactful climaxes. That's not what's happening. And so
there's no surprise having a body double be beheaded and whisking Anne away to a convent in France.
Yeah. And all of that stuff, like that, none of that is going to happen. So your shock and anger with Cromwell that he's doing this, and that he's suddenly playing he's girl bossing too close to the sun. He's Icarusing.
Girl bossing too close to the sun is now the title of this episode.
I trusted this man to be fundamentally good in a bad world, and now I can't really believe that anymore, and it kind of hurts.
It does. And it's crazy, because you're like, oh, because at the same time you still want him to be happy, but you know the wax is going to melt and he is going to plummet down to earth. And it just is such an insane read as a reader, because you want the narrative that should happen narratively when you tell a story, how it should end. It's why sometimes I watch sport. Like a year ago, I guess a year and a half ago, I got into sports, and I followed a team where, like, the quarterback was the last pick. Nobody wanted this guy. He was like at the very end of the draft. Literally every other person who was available got picked. And then he got picked by a team, and he ended up becoming their starting quarterback, doing really well. The team hadn't won in 15 years. They had a great story. Excellent. Fucking cinematic. They went up against a team that had already won the previous year, that had been doing really well. There was nothing. They weren't going to go like, woo, you know, like it wasn't. But that other shit team that I don't love because they beat my team, they won, because that's how fucking life works, and it doesn't care about your story. So narratively, I remember telling my boyfriend, because there's another team that also had a really good story, and I was like, okay, if we don't go to the Super Bowl, I'm okay with them going, because they have a great story. They like a real pick yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. And I was really like, I'm okay with them. And he was like, stories don't work. Sports is pain. Like, you don't, like, a lot of it is luck. Like, did the wind blow in a weird way? Like, how did you throw it? And it's true. And that's what reading this is like, because you're like, but no, the arc, the story, the narrative, the push, and it's heartbreaking to have to watch it play out in the historical way. It's such a singular reading experience, and it's just wild.
I actually think it's really educational, I think, for writers to look at and to read, even if this isn't the kind of thing you want to write. Like, as we talked about here, I am easily seduced by literature because I want everyone to take me super seriously. So I would love to write like this, but I'm not going to. But to understand like this may not be your martial art, but it's important to know different martial arts. And like this is a mode of writing history that's not as historical drama as we're used to, that I think is it's really useful to not necessarily have in your toolbox per se, but to know exists and can look at and take lessons from. And it did lead to the ending of the book being somewhat unsatisfying for me, because we had been building up to this moment and Anne Boleyn gets killed, and like you're kind of like, that's it. Like this had been such an effective build-up, and I don't really want to read the next book. Like when we finished Wolf Hall, I almost started this the next day because I was like, let's go. I know we're bringing the bodies up, and in this one, I'm like, it's gonna be so depressing. Like it's gonna be depressing.
It's
Extra
all bad.
stressy,
It's all
depressing.
bad from here. That's what it should be called. Downhill from here.
Oh,
I hate to.
that's actually true.
The one thing I will say, because this was such a perfect ending to the podcast already, but one thing I will say is that there's a story, right, about how Anne Boleyn asked for a headsman's. No, actually, I think that was a different one. Anyway, Anne Boleyn met her end very regally and very resignedly, and that is really strung out from the point where she's arrested to the end of the book. And I really loved that, how it was portrayed, that she just almost immediately knows, like, oh, I'm defeated. That's it. My cards are out. I will just try to meet this with dignity. It was such a switch in her character. There's also, the audiobook does this thing where early on it mentions that her French accent has kind of gone away for the most part, except for these odd sentences or when she wants to. And you'll notice in the audiobook, he'll put them in a way that adds meaning to specific things. Like she says it when she's trying to like be a little bit more formal at one point with Cromwell, or however she pronounced it in the French, that I thought was just like a very clever thing that's not in the text, but the narrator was able to add. I thought that was cool.
I don't know. I didn't listen to that one.
Okay. Limburg, last thoughts.
History sucks. I honestly don't know.
History is pain.
This is kind of knowing where this is headed. It's hitting a point of grimdark for me, where it hurts me for reality to be so cruel.
It's funny. It reminds me of
story goes.
It reminds me of when I was
I'm in a bad place right now. I'm like, I want a victory. I want an underdog. I want a happy ending.
I want to go back to Cromwell and his wife and their dogs and just chilling at night.
I want to go back to shipping Cromwell with ladies and hearing who's cheating with who.
Yeah,
it's an excellent time.
Yeah, you have to be, I think, in the right mindset, because I'm also slightly depressed at the moment, so this is not the best book to have read, even as good as it is. I'm
very sensitive as well, so I just know that I'm going to be emotionally distraught by the end of the next book, and I'm probably, because I take it so very personally, because I loved Cromwell, and the realization that the people you love, that you know are good mostly, can still be so incredibly disappointing. That's just a really hard lesson to learn.
Yes.
And normally, it doesn't happen in the books where they're the main character.
Yeah.
And
it's my perfect fantasy where things can work out and I can have a good time.
And I think, again, in such a dry way, when I made Maria read Warhammer and I called it grimdark, she was like, this isn't grimdark. I read the 3-body problem. That's a really grim thing. And it actually is true. Warhammer is grimdark in a way that is like gothic and dramatic, whereas the 3-body problem is we have these...
campy.
And campy, right, where it's exaggerated.
Yeah, it's so grimdark, whereas... it creams its pants.
Okay, all right. You haven't read any yet.
Edgy.
You haven't. She's played a little Space Marine too. Okay.
She
hasn't even seen a Astartes yet.
And it has to decorate it with skulls to get the point through.
No, that's a Mechanicus thing. You don't. Okay, guys, I'll educate her later. But anyway, the 3-body problem, which is grimdark in the way of like we have a very simple, cold situation here, that like the reality of it is what's cold and disturbing, and I think that's kind of like this is like he's not a tragic hero in the Byronic sense of like, oh, he's tragic in the way that you learn the adults in your life are not gods, they're people, Nobody has
Yep.
any kind of divinity to them. Everyone in life is kind of just a person trying to get along. They're not encapsulations of ideas or arcs. It's just kind of like, yeah, they're people. They're not always dependable. Again, they do not have the divinity that we think of, that all characters in fiction do have to a certain
Yep.
extent.
If you want to love Cromwell, you have to forgive his faults.
These are some pretty big faults.
I mean, I still think he was mostly right.
I think the problem is he knows what he was doing. Like the entire time, you know, he knows what he's doing, and he's playing this hand, and you're just watching it, and you know exactly.
He's doubling down. He always had this cold center of him. He often refers back to the time when he lost his family and realizations he's had in his life, and he refers to them at that point, after which your heart closes up and hardens. And it really illustrates how
it was such a beautiful
finds
line.
that heart center in himself, and he pulls from it, and he doubles down. He makes the conscious decision to double down with this bad decision. He's still aware that he didn't have to do this, and he's still aware that he could probably defeat Anne in some other way, but he is still choosing to discard the Boleyns.
Yep.
Yeah. Again, I think it's a sobering book in a way that the first one wasn't, even as filled with, violence a bit, that the first one, like, there's still the Tudors. We will read the third one, but we probably will take a little bit of a break. It's also really long. It's like 40 hours, I think, on Audible. Mm-hmm. So we'll the way I'm thinking we'll do it is we'll probably do it over a long. You know how you're always working on a book in the background? Like that's probably what we'll do. Perfect. More of a kind of a thing. And then we'll set it. But yeah, I'm not as excited to read the next one, even though I'm sure it will be very good. She's a really talented writer.
At least in the next one, we're not gonna have to hear about Catherine being a paragon saint and just slowly rotting away in her cold house, because that was quite hard as well.
Yes.
But we are gonna have to hear about Catherine. Jane Seymour dying. I don't want her to die. She's so funny and just cool, and I like her.
Henry's gonna get a son.
I'm actually curious to see how Mantel is going to write that bit, because with the nature, like Jane Seymour isn't going to die in the way of Anne Boleyn. She's not going to be betrayed by everyone she knows and sort of paraded out to be killed publicly. But there is still some nuance to her death that might not be immediately apparent, that is going to be interesting to see what Mantel does with.
And we're also going to see Cromwell do his really big blunder of the Anne of Cleves marriage, which is interesting because up until this point, he hasn't really made any big blunders per se in how he handles things. And so that'll be also interesting to see how the narrative handles it.
Honestly, calling it a blunder with Anne of Cleves when Henry basically later on took back his words and wanted to marry her anyway is just a farce, but yeah, I agree.
I don't actually know that much about it. She tends to be the one that's skipped over a lot because it's just like some kind of ugly German girl, but like I'm excited to see what the author has to say about it.
I think this is just conjecture, but I think she was a case of at the time in painting, stylized painting had become sort of the thing. So monarchs wanted to be portrayed in a certain way, and that way wasn't always necessarily the most
accurate.
Actual representation. They took artful flourishes, let's say, and it was well admitted that everyone did it, so it wasn't a big deal.
For our massive
took
Gen
it as
Z.
This is my bride, and when she showed up and didn't look exactly like her portrait, he was like, "I've been catfished."
Just my joke now.
You catfished me.
For our massive Gen Z audience, what Lindbergh is talking about is that was the equivalent of an Instagram filter or a TikTok filter. The royal line had really got.
What? Kids don't say that anymore?
Okay. All right. Let's see. Yeah. Is that it, guys?
I think that's it. I think that sums it up.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for joining us, all three of you, because this will do badly. I probably won't even edit it because I know this is going to do real poorly. But
Such
you know,
terrible car salesman, Will.
You need to be like me.
it's too late. It's too late. It's
Be
too
more
late.
like Maria.
Hey,
And listen,
guys.
for all of you out there, be more like Maria.
I do like all the comments we get on like some of our videos being like, I read this one book, or like, I'm more into this now, and I always heart those.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Getting people into science fiction.
All right, which of you wants to sign us out?
I will
You just
do
say
it.
bye.
Okay. Thanks for being here, our parasocial darlings. We love you. Bye.